Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the City UK's member briefing on the City UK's Regions and Nations programme. I'm very delighted to be joined this morning by Richard Little, who's our City Chair for Leeds of KPMG, who will be speaking a little later on our work on levelling up, and Nicola Bannister, who is the City UK City Chair from Cardiff, and also Lloyds Banking Group Ambassador for Wales, who will be talking about socioeconomic diversity and social mobility. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being with us. And also to introduce Anjalika Bardalai, the City UK's Chief Economist, who leads our economic research programme, who will briefly, in a minute, when I've done my welcome and introduction, be taking us through some slides on our recently launched Green Finance report. The purpose of these member briefings is to inform members and to get you involved in some of the work that we're doing. And the focus today is of our Regions and Nations programme, which is at the heart of everything that the City UK does in promoting the role of financial and related professional services across the UK in every region and nation of our country. And indeed, it's one of our strategic objectives. And one of the successes that we've had in recent years is to land the message that of the 2.3 million people working across the industry, 2/3 are actually employed outside London. And when I say that this has been successful, that's because we hear this from the Chancellor and the Shadow Chancellor in the House of Commons. So you know your message is getting through when others are using it. So this is one of our successes, but we don't rest on our laurels, and we have to work to do more. And at the heart of our Regions and Nations programme are our 7 city chairs, and we chose these cities where there are significant regional industry hubs, from Bristol to Birmingham, Cardiff to Belfast, Manchester to Leeds and Newcastle. And these are financial and related professional services practitioners who bring together and underpin a network of other industry partners and members in each region and nation. I should say that in Scotland we have a very close partnership with Scottish Financial Enterprise. The 3 topics that were agreed by our city chairs last year when we met on the eve of our national conference, which is our flagship Regions and Nations conference in Bristol, were levelling up socioeconomic diversity and green and sustainable finance, and the role of the industry in enabling the transition to net zero. And we're going to cover each of these topics today and explain what we're doing on each of them. At that same conference, we had keynote speeches from the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, and the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. And we were also delighted to have an excellent keynote speech from Levelling Up Minister Neil O'Brien, who highlighted a number of the policy asks that we put forward earlier last year that the government had actually made progress on. So, for example, in fact, this time last year, in April last year, we launched our roadmap to economic recovery, and we called for a cabinet level minister for overall responsibility for levelling up. We called for a dedicated civil service task force to work across government, and we called for clearer metrics to define the success of the government's levelling up agenda. And I'm pleased to say, and Neil O'Brien recognised this, that there had been progress on many fronts, specifically, obviously, on the appointment of Michael Gove, a cabinet level minister leading on this agenda, and also the setting up of a levelling up task force, which is a cross-governmental committee that works across Whitehall. And I guess the metrics ask is one that's perhaps still in progress. We saw some progress on that in the white paper, where the government has started to define how to measure success in this important agenda. Throughout our Regions and Nations programme, apart from our national conference, we also host very interesting debates and roundtables with local MPs and parliamentarians who are important to this, to regional development. One such roundtable we held was with Clive Betts MP, who is the chair of the Levelling Up Select Committee, who scrutinises the work of Michael Gove's department. We've also been at the heart of policy asks around evolving power and resources to the local level, and also to call on the government to set up government offices outside of London, and indeed to call on the regulators to do the same too. And I'm pleased to say that progress has been made in those areas too. This year, this is just a quick advert, we are holding our next national conference in Edinburgh on the 1st of December, at which we will launch our regional exports report, which tells a very positive story about the industry, because we are the largest net exporting industry in the country. And that has been highlighted recently at our international conference by the International Trade Secretary of State, Anne-Marie Trevelyan. And further to our national conference, one of the other things I wanted to mention at the top is our Enabling Growth report, which highlights, amongst other things, that the tens and thousands of jobs in 20 towns and cities right across the United Kingdom, and also highlights the economic benefit and value add of our industry in those regions. We will be launching that report in September this year, and we hope to do so again outside of London. And we will be using that report at the party conference during the party conference season at the end of September. Now, without further ado, we're really excited to have Richard and Nicola here. I look forward to hearing you speak very shortly. But before we do so, I'd like to hand over to our Chief Economist, Anjalika Bardalai, who will talk us through the main findings of our Green Finance report, which will underpin a number of the roundtables that we're going to focus on in the next phase of our Regions and Nations programme. Anjalika, over to you. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Emma, and good morning, everyone. I will take just about 10 minutes or so to share with you the highlights of our new research. But the first thing I wanted to do is just put the new research report in a little bit of context around, the rest of our work programme. So if we could move to the first slide. We've actually been producing economic research on green finance since 2017. I had formed a research partnership with the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment, and we jointly produced these 3 reports on sort of green finance markets and green bonds and green infrastructure. But our latest report, which we've launched just a couple of weeks ago, is really something quite different. It takes a much wider lens, and we partnered with Refinitiv and used Refinitiv workspace data, and we quantified green finance over the past decade, covering the years 2012 to 21. So I'll share just a little bit of the detail, but first let me share with you really the key messages from the research. So if we could go to the next slide and just go forward a couple of points, that's perfect. So firstly, our new research is unique because it does represent an attempt to do something that's extremely difficult, if not actually impossible to do. And that is because there aren't any standardized definitions of green, which allow for a kind of, hard, in inverted commas, quantification of green finance. And so what that means is that our analysis is indicative. There is literally no way to do comprehensive analysis in this area. But what we've done, I think, is a very important attempt to assess the state of green finance in an objective way. So if we could go forward and forward once again. The headline finding, I think, probably isn't very surprising. Green finance has grown very rapidly from a low base, but we do need to keep this growth in context. It still represents only about 5%, a little bit less than 5% of total finance. And the last point on this slide, please. Everybody loves a ranking, but international comparisons of green financial market activity generally reflect the level of overall financial market activity. And so basically what we found is that, the US and China dominate green finance markets just by virtue of the sheer scale of their finance offering. So I think those are really the key messages from the report. But if we take a few minutes now just to look at some of the detail, we go to the next slide, please. Here you can see 3 things. First, you can see that green finance has indeed grown steadily and significantly over the past decade from a very low base. So according to the definition that we used, green finance rose from $5 billion in 2012 to around $540 billion in 2021. And you can see that definition that we used here on this slide as well, the scope of our analysis included green bonds, IPOs, and private equity. And then the third thing that's obvious from this chart is that green finance is almost completely dominated, in fact, by green bonds. So we found that cumulatively over the 10 years, green bonds accounted for more than 90% of total green finance using our definition. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at green bonds in a little bit more detail. So on the left, you see the rise in both the value and the volume of green bond issuance globally. But green bonds have only existed since 2007, and in the early years, the issuance was undertaken almost exclusively by sovereigns and supranationals. And so we did some additional analysis to see how issuer type has evolved. And what you see from the chart on the right is that it's really only in the last 6 to 7 years that private sector issuance has really taken off. And that means that even though both private and public sector green bond issuance surged in 2021, overall, the market has been driven by sovereign and supranational issuance. And you can see that in a different way on the next slide, please. Thank you. So this table lists the largest green bond markets in absolute terms. And then it gives the split between the public and private sector issuance in each of those markets. And what we found is that with the sole exception of Luxembourg, public green bond issuance comprised at least half of total green bond issuance for the 10 largest issuing nations over the decade 2012 to 21. So that's kind of a summary of global bond trends. With green loans, we had to take a different approach. There's just far less data available. And indeed, the reason that we didn't include green loans in our overall quantification is because we didn't have disaggregated data for the full 10 years. But we were very grateful to AFME, who sent us the data that you see on the next slide, which shows the growth of green lending from a pretty negligible level in 2017 to almost $80 billion in 2021. And in the pie chart on the right, you can also see the regional split, and it's clear that Europe has dominated in this segment. Now, on the next slide, we move on to the equity side of things, and we look at a few different metrics. So here on the left, you see market capitalization of green companies, which we analyzed essentially as an indicative measure because, obviously market cap only gives you a snapshot of valuations at a point in time. We saw that green market capitalization surged in 2020 and 2021, but it's pretty obvious that many factors besides the sort of inherent value of green companies could have affected the share prices of those companies in those years. And so because of that, what we included in our quantification was green IPOs, because IPOs are actually a form of capital raising. And so you see on the right that global green IPO activity has been pretty volatile in both volume and value terms over the past decade. And then there was a surge in activity last year. So cumulatively, there were 129 green IPOs globally over 2012 through 21. Now, those sort of characteristics of volatility and more limited scope of activity on the equity side relative to the debt side was as true for the UK as it was in terms of the global trends. So we analyzed all of the indicators and market segments that were under consideration, both globally and for the UK. And obviously at the country level, we were able to do more granular analysis. And so what you see here on the next slide is, for example, the data on UK green private equity. And so on the left, you see the details of green PE investments into the UK. And on the right, you see green PE investment where the investors were UK based. And basically what you see is that the activity in this segment was concentrated in just a few of the years out of the decade. And our deeper analysis of this data revealed, quite interestingly, that UK investors have mainly channeled their private equity investments into UK businesses in most years. So for example, in 2012, which as you can see from the charts, it was a kind of standout year, UK investors invested around $400 million in the green private equity market. And of that amount, 80% went to UK-based private businesses. And then coming full circle back to green bonds on the next slide, this is another example of our UK-focused analysis. So you can see that green bond issuance in the UK had been fairly limited, but then it surged last year, and very obviously that's due largely to the green gilt issues, which you can see from the blue line. You might be wondering, why are there positive values for the blue line prior to last year, given that last year's green gilts were the first ever UK sovereign green bond issues. And it's basically because the data set aggregated sovereign and supranational issuance. And so prior to 2020, the public, what's given here as public sector issuance is actually EBRD issuance, because of course the EBRD is headquartered in London. But those green gilts last year accounted for fully 1/3 of overall UK green bond issuance over the past decade, which totaled $65 billion. And looking at the private sector, the UK private sector issued 89 green bonds over the period. So the last thing that I'll share with you is just a little bit of the work that we did on international comparison. So as I mentioned in my introduction, what we found is that green finance markets are highly correlated with overall financial markets, which tend to be correlated with the size of countries' economies. And so, as I said, it's totally logical that when you look at markets in absolute size, the US and China tend to dominate by huge margins. But as we were doing this analysis, I thought, well, it doesn't necessarily give us any insight in particular into green finance markets. And because of that, we decided to dig a little bit deeper, and we used a second methodology to analyze markets in relative terms. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the results, for example, for green bonds here. And what you see is the results in absolute terms on the pie chart and the results in relative terms in the table. So just to be clear, the table shows, I guess, what I would call green bond penetration. So it is perhaps a more interesting indicator than just observing that, as a percentage of the global total, the US and China have the world's largest markets. That's what you see on the left. The table lists the countries that have the highest percentage of green bonds relative to total bonds, and it presents them in descending order of the value of green bond issuance. That presentation is because mathematically, the relative approach favors smaller markets. I'm sure that's evident, but if people are curious about the details, we can cover that later in the discussion, or indeed after this meeting. And you can see that we included the US and China at the bottom of the table as well, just to really emphasize the scale difference. On the next slide, you can see that those trends are even more pronounced looking at equity markets. So here you can see that the US, China, and Germany dominated green IPO activity, accounting for around 3/4 of total global green IPOs over 2012 to 2021. You can see that Germany actually stands out on a relative basis as well. Green bonds accounted for almost 10% of its total bonds over the decade. So as you can tell, there's lots of data and analysis in our new research. Of course, I'd encourage you to download the full report and take a look at the detail. But the last thing I'll share with you before we move on to the next part of this meeting is this graphic on the last slide. So this is something I've actually borrowed from research undertaken by the City of London Corporation, and it highlights the role of the wider ecosystem. So our report focused on green finance, but the related professional services of legal and accounting and consulting complete the ecosystem. And the UK's very well-established strengths in these sectors might very well help enhance the UK's international position in green finance. And of course, all of the regions and nations will have an important role to play in that regard. So I hope that's given you a good overview of our new research. I know I've thrown a lot of analysis at you, so just on the very last slide, I leave you once again with the key messages, and thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand back to Emma.
Thank you so much, Anjalika, for that summary and for all the work that you put into the Green Finance report. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank BNP Paribas and Refinitiv, who made this report possible, and also the City UK's Green and Sustainable Finance Group, in particular its chair, Anne-Marie Verstraeten, who's the country head of BNP Paribas too, for all of their contributions. We launched this report only a few weeks ago, and I'd encourage people to take a more detailed look at it. There's a lot of interesting findings in there, some of which that Anjalika's brought out, but there's a lot to the report. So we'll put that link in the Q&A so people can see it. And we'll be using this report to underpin the next phase of our engagement in the Regions and Nations programme, and to look in particular at the enabling role, as I said earlier, of our industry in that crucial transition to net zero, and what impact recent events and the higher energy prices might have on that transition too. We'd like people to get involved, so we know many members on this call are focused heavily on these issues. And in fact, in our member research and our member survey, the issue of sustainability and the role of green and sustainable finance has shot up people's agenda. And so we hope that you'll take this opportunity to engage both with the report, but also with the regional roundtables series that will be taking place in a few months' time. Please do flag your interest to your account lead at the City UK if you would like to attend one of these events. Now on something a little bit different, Richard, we're really keen to hear your insights and your reflections on the very hot political topic of levelling up, something that the government has staked a lot on, arguably the next general election on it too. So it's a political hot potato, something that is very, very topical. And something that our industry has a key role to play in and a huge contribution to make. Richard, we're really delighted to have you. You're our city chair for Leeds and a tax partner at KPMG. And over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emma. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm doing politics, so I'm going to be slightly careful this morning, but also wanting to thank the whole team at the City UK for organising this morning's event. So I'm going to talk about levelling up, and also importantly highlight some of the work that City UK has been doing and will continue to be doing on this very important topic. Why is it important to me? Well, I was born near Shrewsbury, grew up in Birmingham. Went to university and spent the first 15 years of my career at KPMG in Manchester, and I've spent the last 14 years in Leeds. So the prosperity opportunity that can be generated by all of the regions and nations of the UK is really important to me from a personal perspective, and that's why I was delighted to take on the City UK city chair role for Leeds a couple of years ago. As Emma said, this is the central domestic policy agenda of this government. We finally got the white paper earlier in 2022, and the fundamental purpose of that white paper is to turn what I think everyone can accept is a very, very powerful slogan into something that sets out practical steps that can change the lives of people across the UK, and then from a business perspective presents both some interesting opportunities and very important challenges for all of us as employers and businesses within the financial and professional services sector across the UK. So the white paper's more than 300 pages long and has as its core 12 levelling up missions. Now, what was really positive to see was that a number of the proposals in the white paper reflected topics that the City UK had previously called for and championed in a number of our activities. So what did they include? Well, they included, in particular, extending devolution, so to various additional communities, in extension to what we already have. Again, from my personal perspective, I think the mayors that have been in place now for the longest period of time, and the ones that I'd call out, in addition, obviously, to London, would be Bristol, the West Midlands, Liverpool, Greater Manchester and Teesside, have made a huge difference to the economies of those particular cities and regions. And therefore, I think the extension of mayoralties into other parts of the country has to be recognised and encouraged. And that leads on to a second key theme, which is fundamentally about local input into decisions about the money that government spends and invests, whether that be central government or local government. And last but not least, the white paper talks about employers, so all of us, having a greater involvement in the talent and skills agenda, in particular around skills in mapping what skills exist already and defining what industry and education's needs are going to be for the future. Now, one thing that I think become crystal clear is an election in 2019, a white paper that comes out in early 2022 demonstrates that change is going to take a long time. And the government accepted in its white paper that this goes well beyond the current electoral cycle. So in 2024, I think the current government will be certainly asking for permission to carry on with this agenda. But I think what's equally important is it needs cooperation across all parts of government. And I think that in itself is a significant challenge, the coordination of central government departments to deliver these objectives. Then the coordination between central and local government. And last, and very importantly, the coordination and cooperation between businesses and government. So over the next few months, what's the City UK going to be doing to respond to this topic? Well, first of all, members should be able to contribute and look out for our initial strategic response to the white paper's themes. That's going to be developed in conjunction with the City Chair Network and shared with you all as members, so it can be included in your own policy and government relations work. Secondly, when the opportunity arises to feedback specifically to government on proposals, please share your feedback on areas of policy that could be improved to benefit the communities within which you operate. And thirdly, it's been a key objective of the City UK. Emma's already mentioned the statistics around the strength of the sector in and outside of London, that we want to continue to talk about the successes of financial and professional services in promoting economic growth and prosperity across the whole of the UK. So please share those examples of best practice. We're going to continue to hold regular roundtable events with insights from a full range of speakers. And one example that is being worked on literally as we talk today is work in conjunction with a new commission that's been set up by the MP Bim Afalami, who's looking at the role of our industry in driving the levelling up agenda. So, as I say, the team at City UK is in the process of arranging those sessions with Bim and his team. I hope that's given you a good sense of both the importance of the topic, but also the work that that you as members, together with the team at City UK, can deliver in terms of engagement with each other, with government, both central and local, and also with our wider stakeholders on what I believe is a massively important topic. With that, I'll hand back to Emma, and again, we'll have the opportunity to talk, Emma, in the Q&A in some more detail.
Absolutely, and look forward to that. Thanks so much for explaining the work that we're doing and the importance of the industry in the government's agenda. And I just echo your encouragement to members to share their feedback on this critical area, and also share examples, because when we go to meet ministers, MPs, officials and others, it's really important to have those case studies in those local areas that are significant to those particular stakeholders. It was really, really powerful to have that. Numbers are one thing, they only tell a certain part of the story. Many politicians in particular want to hear about examples. So thanks to members who've already provided those, and we've got some good ones on the stocks, but we're always in the market for others. So thank you so much, Richard, for running through that, and look forward to discussing in a bit more detail in a minute around some of those themes. But before we do that, I would like to welcome our third and final speaker, Nicola Bannister, of Lloyds Banking Group. Nicola, you're also the Group Ambassador for Wales, so you're a busy woman, and thanks so much for being with us as City Chair for Cardiff. You're going to talk about social mobility and socioeconomic diversity, so over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma, and hi, everyone. So I'll probably start by saying, like Richard, this is a subject that's really, really close to my heart: social mobility, socioeconomic diversity. I've been delighted to be the City UK Chair for Wales now, or for Cardiff for a small period of time, but for longer to be the Group Ambassador on behalf of Lloyds Banking Group for Wales. I'm the daughter of a steelworker and the granddaughter of a miner, and the first generation in my family to go to university. And I feel really privileged to have the career I have today in financial services. And I'm really keen that we keep this subject alive and do what we can to help the next generations coming through. Now, in Lloyds Banking Group, we're really committed to creating a fully inclusive environment for our colleagues, for our communities, and for our customers. And inclusion and diversity is a really important part of our new strategy. We track and measure data across diverse groups, and we've got actions in place to drive greater diversity at all levels of our organisation. We make public commitments around those to increase diversity both at board and senior levels, and share our gender and ethnicity pay gap data publicly. Socioeconomics, though, do not stand alone and cut across all of the diversity groups, and they are really complex. And we're in the early stages of understanding this and are approaching it from three key perspectives. So in terms of colleagues, socioeconomics is a key driver in our group people strategy, and we're considering how we recruit as well as retain colleagues from a broader range of socioeconomic backgrounds. We've got work to do to identify the changes that we need to make. The second one is culture. And our inclusion and diversity teams have taken a deeper look at the makeup of our organisation to better understand the socioeconomic diversity that we have today amongst our existing colleague base. And with this, we're going to examine our culture further and look at the changes we need to make. And then the third element is community, so focusing on how we can support communities through programmes and colleague outreach. Wider than that, though, the City UK has absolutely been playing its part with partners in moving forward the conversation on these issues. Every day I see how we're working to support people and communities who are in difficulty. And so I was delighted when I was asked, alongside Catherine Finn, who's my fellow City Chair of PwC of Bristol, to chair a roundtable for members to really look across Bristol, the South West, Wales, Cardiff, to look at what can we do to support, what insight could we give to discuss with the independent task force on socioeconomic diversity. And that was part of a series of events that the City UK ran for industry representatives to feed in. And I think the last one was chaired by Richard very recently, and that's all been fed into the task force being led by the City of London Corporation. Now, on the call that I helped to co-chair, we had Kay Forsyth, who was the delivery lead for industry consultation as part of the task force, and we stimulated some really good debate. Now, if I think back to that day, we started with a bit of a hypothesis that fit and polish have traditionally trumped talent and potential in terms of recruitment in financial services and in terms of successful career progression. We spent some time reflecting on the importance of storytelling from senior leaders of their backgrounds, something that historically they may not have been comfortable sharing or talking about their own personal journeys. We talked about the role that government, policymakers and sector bodies can have in encouraging greater socioeconomic diversity. We talked about data gathering and the challenges of data gathering, particularly around protected characteristics, the types of questions that organisations, some of whom are already quite ahead in this field and some of whom are just starting to do this, but what type of data do you gather? Is it about somebody's education? Is it their parents' job, their father's job, their highest earning parent? Is it whether their parents went to university? And then the psychological safety that has to accompany that type of questioning of colleagues, whether that's existing colleagues or colleagues who will be new to an organisation. How do we do this in a way that isn't intrusive, that comes from the right intent and create confidence? Asking where you're from and what do your parents do can be invasive questions. We then talked about keeping this sort of data up to date. So do we have annual surveys? What do the response rates look like on those? How do we make sure we get this data accurately? And then once you've got that data, how do you record it? Many of the HR systems and tools that we use today won't have fields for this type of information. So how do we store it in a way that is safe and that people are comfortable with? And then also, how do we use it? How do we store it in a way that we can draw down on it and manipulate it in ways that gives us the answers that we want from that data and helps us really analyse what's going on in our organisations and in our colleague bases and what we can learn from that? And if there's all good data, that's going to lead to targets and that's going to lead to benchmarking. And what does that look like? So we spent some time talking around targets, and I've no doubt that might be a subject in the Q&A later. We also reflected on the overlay of different socioeconomic diversities with other diversities. So what does that mean? How do you set targets around gender, around ethnicity, and then around socioeconomic diversity too? How do they intersect, and what's the right answer around targeting in that space? We just talked quite a fair bit about culture and the culture organisations need to adopt and the safety they need to create to foster these conversations and to create advocates, to get sponsorship from the top down and support from the bottom up that this is the right thing to do. And then we reflected a little bit wider around how do we get into the school system? How do we get into education? How do we get into kids' hearts and minds about the careers that they want? How do we make financial services feel appealing to them? People from different socioeconomic backgrounds might not always think of financial services or banking as somewhere they want to work. So how do we do that? And how do we build the resilience in them for applying for the types of roles that they might want to do, encouraging them to do so, and then helping them with careers in that space? And then finally, the last thing we reflected on was the role of the pandemic in changing the way that we work. So historically, if you have hubs, and in my day job, my hubs are across the country, but I've got hubs in places like Hove, in Petrevy, up in Dunfermline, Chester, Wales, and are these hubs in places where we're going to attract real socioeconomic diversity? But does the pandemic, with the creation of more work from home and work flexibility, give us the opportunity to reflect on where we recruit people from and the bases and the types of people that come into our organisations? So that was a bit of an overview of the session that we had, and it may prompt some discussion in the Q&A later. But certainly the City UK will continue to develop its voice on these issues and the wider questions around social mobility, especially in the context of our programme and our work around the regions and nations of the UK. So please do keep looking out for future events, and hopefully you get a sense of the type of things we discuss at them. They are incredibly powerful. As well as the task force, the City UK also supports and helped to found the Financial Services Skills Submission, who back in March this year launched their Future Skills Report, which detailed the 5 future skills that they see as business critical to survive in the digital and data age. Data analytics, software development, and creative thinking are just some of those key skills that the report deemed as essential for securing the future success of financial services and tackling the ongoing skills gap that we face today. Their report's available on their website, but that's an interesting intersection again with the socioeconomic diversity challenge that we face. Now, these sorts of issues are going to continue to be really important to us and to policymakers, and there are a number of ways that you and members can engage with this agenda. So first of all, please make sure your organisations are engaging with the Diversity and Exchange Network, which draws together the City UK's efforts across the financial and related professional services ecosystem to achieve greater impact and accelerate the pace of change across a number of areas: data collection, challenges and solutions, long-term behavioural change, supporting social mobility, engaging better with ethnic diversity, and addressing intersectionality. And secondly, already as Richard's mentioned, please do ensure that your relevant colleagues across regions and nations are engaging with the City UK events agenda. Please speak to your designated City UK account manager if you'd like to suggest specific colleagues for them to invite. And whilst there's much to do to improve mobility and diversity within financial and related professional services, we know there's a huge amount being done to strengthen our industry across the board. So please do share your case studies, your insights and your experiences with us. They're really powerful. And as Emma's already said, that kind of qualitative, real insight accompanies and is so much more powerful alongside the data that we have. So please do share and please do link in through our member events. And with that, I think I'm going to hand back to Emma for us to get into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nicola, and welcome back to all of our panelists. Thank you, Richard and Anjalika. So I thought, given that levelling up is such a major issue of the day, that we'd start with some questions around that. But I'm going to abuse my position of chair and put a few questions to you. But I would encourage our audience to pop any questions that they have in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please do feel free to ask what you'd like. So I think my first question really is drawing on something that you said, Richard, about coordination. And we already know, and you know, this is not a party political point. This is something that happens in all governments, that governments in departments tend to work in silos, and many businesses have this problem too, right? So you talked about coordination across government, and then between government and local government, and then between business and government. I was really interested in those 3 different types of coordination. I just wondered, Richard, from your point of view, where are we getting this right, and where does there need to be more progress? And in terms of where you're sitting in Leeds, what do you think that third piece, how do you think the third piece is going, i.e. the coordination between business and government on this agenda?
So I think it's very easy to be quite hard on ourselves, because I think there is an awful lot of positive work already going on. You're spot on about the silos that exist. And I think the biggest challenge of all of this is probably for central government to better coordinate its work across its own departments. But I think the positives that I talk about, Emma, are, I think there's an awful lot of engagement that is already going on a day-to-day basis between business and local government. I mentioned the mayors in various regions, and obviously the number of mayors has been expanded in the last couple of years and will continue to be expanded. So I think that's another level of opportunity for members to engage with devolved policymakers. The other thing, I think it has been a slogan that has been developed by one political party, but let's not forget that the opposition has identified that this is a fundamental issue in terms of the success of the UK economy. The Labour Party's put, I believe, one of its most effective shadow cabinet members as the shadow for the Levelling Up Department in the case of Lisa Nandy. And this is going to be a multi-generational task that we all face up. So I think we can be clear that all political parties are committed to this. The other thing that I think businesses can do from a practical perspective is that wider ecosystem engagement. And what do I mean by that? I mean on the skills and talent perspective that we've talked a lot about today. And Nicola talked about it as well. It's about that engagement locally with schools, with universities, with colleges, because the ability of businesses to work with the main providers of education, I think, will be fundamentally important, because I think one of the really practical steps that people will be able to see of levelling up is that ability to not only take in different and diverse talent into our organisations, but then during their careers with us, seeing the opportunity to pick up new skills and be retrained and reskilled as we meet the challenges of technology. So I think there's a huge amount still to be done. I think there's a positive place from which to work. And you asked about Leeds. I think the big difference for us in our city is, we did have and still continue to have a strong city council who are very interested in what businesses are doing in the city and the wider city region. The new dimension for us is Tracy as our Mayor of West Yorkshire, which again helps to further put the region on the map and gives business the ability to interact with a key provider of local government direction and leadership.
No, absolutely. And in fact, we've had a question just come in as I just put that question to you, just come in from Connor. Thank you, Connor, about this. So I think you've gone some way to answering this, Richard, but I wanted to put this to you. A problem that we see around the country is different appetites of local and combined authorities. We heard this from other members too, that in areas where there are combined authorities, they tend to have a really good dialogue with the private sector, but in areas where they don't, it's patchier. And this, Connor says, as well as delivery agencies and bodies to work with the private sector, how does the City UK help make the case to these bodies that in order to deliver their visions, they need to work better with the private sector? So I think this is a question of, in some parts of the country, this is working quite well, in others not so well. What can we do to help in the areas where it's not working so well? Any thoughts on that, Richard?
So I think, first of all, it's incumbent on us as individual businesses to be thinking about the difference we can make in that engagement process. And Connor is spot on that there is not a one size fits all at the moment at all. I think where City UK and the city chairs can help is in providing that single point of contact, and to your point, bringing in the examples of where it has worked well in one particular region that we can then deploy into others. I say it isn't one size fits all, and the reason I believe that City UK set up the network originally was to to reflect those regional differences, and then be able to share experience and bring the best of what's working in one particular place into the rest of the country.
Absolutely, and actually that's really interesting. It leads us on to, we've had a really good question on levelling up from James. He says, with reference to levelling up, we also need to consider levelling up within the regions themselves. I think this is an absolutely excellent point. I want to come to you, Nicola, on this because it will be particularly pertinent, I think, in Wales. For example, what London does to the rest of the country, Leeds, for example, does to other cities and towns in Yorkshire. It's interesting. Thank you, James. And what needs to be done to ensure it's not only cities that realise the benefits of levelling up? Nicola, given your not only your City UK role, but your Lloyds banking ambassadorial role, be interested in your view of that.
Yeah, great question. And I love the way I've got a levelling up question. So which is probably, you're going to get one on socioeconomic diversity. Don't worry, we'll balance it out. But no, it's a great question. And it is something we talk quite a lot about, because I think obviously Wales is a very diverse country, and there's so much going on in terms of the different industries, the different sectors. We've got the coast, we've got, you know, the north, and then you've got the south. And there is this sense that the M4 corridor is the powerhouse, but actually, you know, we've got a broad population, a broad range of skills. And in fact, I think when we first spoke, Emma, we were talking about one of my key sites is in Chester, and we have an awful lot of North Welsh colleagues coming over the border every day to work, and the challenges that we face with that over the pandemic has been really interesting. But I do think we've got to start conversations at more of that regional level, because it's not just about the city, although the opportunities that the pandemic provide to create more flexibility in terms of where people can work is something that we've really got to leverage, and how that can help local communities in terms of people being there during the day to spend their money. How can we create more opportunity for people to work more flexibly across Wales? But that's going to require better infrastructure as well. So take digital infrastructure and the rollout of Wi-Fi, and that being spread across the country effectively and easily as well, because we do find that there are challenges around the accessibility to digital infrastructure, and that's going to be a challenge too. So I think while there will be some opportunities coming, I do think it needs to be part of the levelling up agenda more broadly, and not just focused on kind of the key cities and hubs, although they will help. It needs to disseminate wider from there.
Fantastic. And Richard, do you have a perspective on this? I like the way James put it. What Leeds to other cities and towns in Yorkshire? I thought that was an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, it is a really good point. I mean, let's remember that what levelling up is not about is about diminishing London, and we want everywhere to be successful. But James, you are very right. Equally, I would say that, you know, we are lucky in West Yorkshire and wider Yorkshire that, as well as the businesses that locate around Leeds, there's also a very strong financial and professional services community in Bradford, similarly in Sheffield, similarly in Skipton, similarly in York. So, you know, there is more than one hub, but I think that the challenge that has been identified is, you know, the coastal towns. Again, Yorkshire has several of them that have suffered from probably years, decades of relative underinvestment and neglect need to be thought about, and also the towns that provide potentially talent to the cities, but what is it that makes them attractive to employers in their own right? I don't think people have the answer yet, but the recognition that you do need to look across the region as a whole, I think, is incredibly important.
Absolutely. And related to that, Lee Mayer, our city chair in Belfast, thanks so much, Lee, for putting this in the Q&A. Related to that, what is your view of, Nicola, I'll come to you, and I do have a question about socioeconomic diversity, I'll come to in a minute. What's your view about how the pandemic might have helped the levelling up agenda? Has working from home created greater distribution over the UK of people working in the industry? This is from Lee.
I don't know if it's created greater distribution. I think it's created the opportunity for it, because if I take my own organisation, people who used to be in the office 5 days a week can now work from home with more flexibility. And actually, you know, we've taken some of our colleagues who used to work within our branch network, and they've sort of converted more to like telephony type roles. So there are now colleagues more distributed across the UK, whereas historically our telephony roles would be based in a firm site that was very clearly a telephony site. So I do think that type of thing has meant there's more flexibility for people now. what we need to do as a next step, I think, in terms of opening up the minds of businesses, is to say that could we then recruit? Can our recruitment pool for a role be anywhere within the UK? So, and then I think there are challenges to work through around how do you induct people, how do you keep them engaged, how do you support them, how do you develop them? But I think that sense that it could open up the pathways for future recruitment, I think, is really interesting. And then how can we use it to help solve some of the brain drain that we see? So, for example, people who are may come finish their schooling in Wales, choose to go to a Welsh university, but then feel that they have to move to London or elsewhere for their employment. How can we get that organisation between schools and then higher education institutions, whether that's somewhere people go on to do an apprenticeship or a degree or whatever it may be? How can we create tighter connection between employers and those organisations so the very best people can get the roles without having to physically relocate? So I don't think that the shift to working from home with the pandemic's the full answer, but I think it can open the gateway to other interesting questions.
Brilliant. And actually it links to Lee's question that I wanted to put to you, Nicola, around social mobility and socioeconomic diversity. So Lee asks, how do we sensibly and sensitively capture and track how we are improving our social mobility in the industry?
That is one of the $1 million questions, because I think there's a number of things we need to work through to get to the right answer there. I think the psychological safety point that I talked a bit about that we have within our when we had our recent session that Catherine and I chaired, I think that's a fantastic example of how do you create an environment where people feel comfortable sharing this, know why we're asking and know why it's important to share. And I think while through new recruitment, we might get good insight on that as people come into organisations, how do you get your existing colleague base to open up so you really understand where you are today? And I think that's going to be a significant challenge for many organisations to get that full buy-in to people having to go into their HR systems or wherever it might be to share that data. And I think organisations I talked to today are struggling to get people to do that from an ethnicity perspective, let alone from a socio-diverse perspective, which can be more hidden than their ethnicity and less apparent. And people feel a sense of not wanting to share that with their employer for whatever reason. So I think getting it onto the agenda is something that we're passionate about, and understanding why we want to talk about it, and then what we're going to do with that information. So why tell us? So we can just report it and set ourselves a target and hit it. What are we going to do to create advocacy, sponsorship, invest in the people that come forward and share their backgrounds so that we can appeal to more? I think there's a whole piece of work to define how that can really work well. And you know, I think it's going to take us time to build that, and we're going to learn, and we need to keep sharing our experiences on what works and what doesn't. So more talking between the regional members will be really powerful.
I totally agree. And Richard, I'd be interested in your perspective on this.
Yeah, so we at KPMG have been capturing exactly that data that Nicola just talked about. We're currently getting that data from between 70 and 75% of our colleagues. So that's good, but clearly that means that there's 25% that have been unwilling or unable for whatever reason to share it. And I think Nicola made the great point that it's about, I think, demonstrating that why is the target that we have set ourselves, which is to improve our socioeconomic diversity of our leadership group by 2030. Why is that important? And it then comes back to role models and examples. So on the Leeds roundtable that we did on exactly this topic, the example I gave of our office senior partner in Liverpool, I think is the most powerful example of an individual, Jen, who was the first to go to university, experienced some awful comments about how she might work in business, not in KPMG and not in professional services, but in other parts of business. And her story about how she met those challenges, how she ended up working at a firm like KPMG, and how she's now been incredibly successful. I think the most inspiring thing about why this topic's important and why it makes a difference.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with the important role of role models in our industry and in others. Anjalika, I'm going to give you the final word. I just wondered whether you could say very briefly a little bit about what are the things that we include in our Enabling Growth Report, which is really our flagship Regions and Nations annual report. And then I'm going to close, but over to you quickly.
Indeed, yeah. If I may, I'll actually just link the response to that question to the other question that came in about the distribution, whether the pandemic has affected the distribution of industry jobs. At an aggregate data level, actually, the short answer is we just don't know, because the latest data that we have available, looking at industry jobs by region, is from 2020, which was, of course, the early stage of the pandemic. There's also a very sort of interesting question, which is going to be a longer term thing around something that, Nicola mentioned is, can you start doing a UK-wide recruitment pool, but, the data actually at the moment look at where the job is rather than where the person is. So that's kind of a longer term, wider challenge, but one for another discussion. So indeed, as you mentioned, we will launch new research in September. It is one of our kind of flagship reports that looks essentially at the contribution of the financial and related professional services industry to all of the different regions, nations, cities, towns, even at the constituency level. Essentially, we look at the industry's contribution to local employment and to GVA, gross value added.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I think I'm going to run us just about to time. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to all the members who have attended the webinar. A particular big thanks to those who put in questions. We've had a really good level of questions. We don't always have that. So thank you so much, Connor, James and Lee. And thank you finally, and most importantly, to Nicola, Richard and Anjalika, for your presentations, but also for the discussion we've just had. And just to encourage members that there is lots of ways in which that you, if you don't already, which many of your organisations already do, but if you don't already, you want to get involved in our Regions and Nations programme, whether it's attending the launch of our Enabling Growth Report in September, or whether it's getting more involved in some of the regional networks that our city chairs lead in different parts of the country. So thanks again to everybody, and have a wonderful sunny day wherever you may be. Thank you.